Okay. Okay, hello and welcome everyone. We're about to start. Welcome to our Global Leadership Speaker Series. Thank you all for being here today with us. The Global Leadership Speaker Series is an initiative from the Center for Global Partnerships and Learning and the Associate Dean's Office. This event will focus on the myriad topics that impact the leadership in the global space, and the events will be from April to June this year. In April, we have 3 speakers. We had Dr. June Schmieder on the 6th. We have Dr. Erik Schockman with us today, and we will have Dr. Jenny Walker on the 27th. You can all register for this event. We will post the link for registration in the chat shortly. So before I introduce our keynote speaker, I'd like to share some information about the Center. The Center for Global Partnerships and Learning provides the GSCP students with various services ranging from publication support, certificate programs, access to GSCP Academic Journal, the Scholarship Without Borders, and a few other services such as cultural celebrations, info sessions, and workshops. So now, let me introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Erik Schockman. So Dr. Schockman is a professor of politics and international relations at Woodbury University. He also teaches in the MPA program at the CSU Northbridge and the PhD program in Global Leadership and Change at Pepperdine University. Dr. Schockman previously served as Associate Dean and Associate Adjunct Professor at the Sol Pride School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California. He was president and founder of the Global Hunger Foundation, dedicated to helping women in the developing world break the chains of poverty by funding projects designed to provide sustainable development and organic farming. He served as CEO and president of a prestigious international anti-hunger organization for over a decade, pumping some 60 million in grants into the field. Dr. Schockman served as vice president of the Californian League of Conservation Voters Educational Fund, supervising environmental public opinion polling and statewide voter engagement. He was the top consultant to the California State Assembly and the Los Angeles City Council. Dr. Schockman also served as policy director for the City of Los Angeles, elected the Charter Reform Commission. Dr. Schockman founded the National Anti-Hunger Organizations, an alliance of all major national anti-hunger organizations in the U.S. Additionally, Dr. Schockman was a member of the National Interfaith Hunger Director Committee. He was on the founding board of directors of the Global Food Banking Network. The Senate Rules Committee appointed him to the California State Library Commission. He was the former chair of the California Post-Secondary Education Commission, appointed by the Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, appointed by California State Assembly Speaker Emeritus Antonio Villaraigosa. Erik has also served on the Little Hoover Commission, a bipartisan independent body whose function is to promote efficiency, effectiveness, and economy in state programs. He served in the Peace Corps in Sierra Leone, West Africa, and taught agricultural and sustainable development. Dr. Schockman speaks before elected officials and professionals and community organizations across the country, and frequently quoted in the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Dallas Morning News, CNN, NPR, and other national publications and in electronic media. He has also written several books and edited many articles on leadership and politics in California, the national and international affairs, and presented on panels on these same topics. His two most recently edited volumes are titled Breaking the Zero-Sum Game, Transforming Societies Through Inclusive Leadership by Emerald Press, Peace, Reconciliation, and Social Justice Leadership in the 21st Century, The Whole of Leaders and Followers by Emerald Press as well. Dr. Schockman holds a PhD in Political Science and International Relations from the University of California. And today, Dr. Schockman will talk about the impact of Ukraine war on the global order. So please, everyone, help me to welcome Dr. Schockman.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for spending a few minutes with me. And I'd like to thank the Center for Global Leadership and the speaker series that put this together. Kudos to you all. And I'd like to recognize that many of my students are also here, thinking they're going to get an extra grade out of this or an extra credit, but of course they know I can't be bought. So I say that with all delight to see some names and faces. So thank you for all attending. So let's get right into it, because I think we have till 6 o'clock, and I'd like to leave some dialogue and Q&A at the end. So I will jump right into it, if I may, and share my screen because I think it is behooves us to look at the global power order that we are confronting today. And I'd like to say back into from the macro perspective, and then back into the Ukrainian crisis as a demonstration of the new ordering of what I see in the world, and what my grandchild and many of your great-grandchildren will inherit, given the precipice that we're currently on. And I just will present a few slides to get our intellectual juices flowing, because I think there's a lot to be unpacked and a lot of prognosis to crystal ball the future. But based on the realities of what I see today, I think it's not a happy picture. And I say that as a perennial optimist, always looking for the best in people and the best in society. But we have to admit, at times things are out of our power, and maybe we leave it to a higher power in the end to get us through apparent crisis in the world. So let me talk about the Ukraine as an example, and the geopolitics that currently has, and that's misspelled, by the way, and that we are confronting in the world. So let me start with the Ukrainian situation, because it is all on our minds, I think, and the war in Ukraine is an ongoing challenge with implications for global governance and international relations. Many of my students will look at these citations and take homage from the theorists that we've been reviewing. But I think from my observation, we've now passed the Rubicon for the tensions between the West and Russia. There's great limitations currently on the international institutions and the intensification of geopolitical rivalries. And let me just mention here that ever since World War II, there's been a bipolar arrangement between us and the USSR until perestroika and the devolution of the Russian Federation. And Gorbachev led the way, and ultimately we had a reign of maybe 30 years, 25, 30 years, where we were the unilateral power in the world. We were the peacemakers. We were also the agitators. We being the United States, were also the guarantor of world peace, using our cachet of military strength, our economic power, and one would say our value structure exported to democratic societies around the world. What has happened in the recent war in Ukraine, we have now seen a new evolution, I think, that we that begins to concern us. The alignment of Russia, China, and some Eastern countries that are problematic in themselves, some that exist in Asia, North Korea in particular, some of the countries in the Caucasus aligning on this sort of axis with China and Russia. And now we've seen a NATO confluence with the West taking on this new global hegemony of a trochea of power structure. And I think what I see is this new emergence of international battling of ideology, economic structures, and the forces we could compare it to good and evil. I'd like to compare it to a Greek tragedy. This is my analysis of the Greek tragedy that's in front of us. So if for those of you who are fluent in studying Greek mythology, you remember that Zeus and as the principal god was always in battle with the other gods in this stratosphere of godhood, where they lived on Mount Olympus and they threw lightning at each other, and there was this battle on top, which ultimately the gods battled themselves, and mere mortals on the planet, mere mortals, Electra, Ulysses, you name the mere mortals, they went through their lives and they sort of got through their lives. And, the Greek tragedy is always this battle of the gods on one level and then the mortals on the other. So I compare today to that exact strategy, that we're now living in where China, the United States, and Russia are the new gods, if you use this metaphor, and they are battling on the superstructural sphere, and then we mortals are on the planet trying to get by, knowing that we're preordained for disposal, given that we should be focusing on climate change. there should be the gods and mortals working together to ultimately solve the existential crises that are going to kill us all. But right now, this distraction with superpower structure, competition of ideology, competition of who will win this sort of new stratum of priority is distracting the gods, the Greek gods. And we will suffer for this, not only with existential climate change, as I mentioned, but the mere notion that we will have more Ukraine eruption, more test cases that will continue to distract us from the main issues in front of us, to really solve issues that are global in nature and ultimately human in nature. And if we don't bring us together, if we don't bring the gods back to earth, we will again eventually be destroyed in this superstructure of this Greek tragedy. So my metaphor, hopefully we can talk about it, but I mean, I think it holds substance because nothing changes. And again, the Greeks were always ahead of their time and prognosis of how the gods will ultimately win in their own strata, and humans will suffer because of it. So that is given the sort of contextual basis of state leaders now balancing national interest, international norms, multinational cooperations, which have really sort of evaporated in this mania of taking care of the superstratum of geopolitical transformation, of a new economic structure being formed or lack thereof, with globalization now perhaps retreating rather than advancing. I'm not a big fan of globalization. There are winners and losers in globalization, but I think we were making at least a better world in intertwining our economics for a greater good. And there are winners and losers, and I would have worked on globalization to enhance world peace, but clearly I think we're now at a new worrisome juxtaposition where globalization is now evaporating in itself, and nations are turning to isolationism and retreat back into their encampments of Marxism versus capitalism. So fellowship also is exerting pressure on political leaders through civil society, media, and public opinion to do the right thing. I think we are seeing a lot of the pressures to become more of a global society after COVID, which I'll talk about in a minute. But we've been hitting the solar plexus for planning for the next iteration of the next pandemic. And again, like my metaphor of the battling Greek gods, this indeed becomes more problematic as fellowship wants, the followers want to exert pressure on the local level. They can't really rise to the level of these power brokers who are managing the world affairs. And I think the war in Ukraine is reflective of this angst of who will win this battle between democracy and authoritarianism, or will there be some intercept like Macron is trying to do to make peace between the great powers and be the neutral arbitrator and trying to bring this to a closure. These are, I think, just lay out some of the structures that I'm concerned about. And as I mentioned, the pandemic sort of got in the way as we started to move down this path as a global crisis with far-reaching impact that exacerbated existing social, economic, and political inequalities, For many of my students, we've been focused on the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has given us on a macro level. Many of those Sustainable Development Goals have taken a retreat given the pandemic and the exacerbation of inequities that have continued to plague women, poverty, food crisis, etc. So my concern again is that we've set some lofty goals with the United Nations driving them. We've had great momentum prior to the pandemic, and now we're sliding back with many of the Sustainable Development Goals that are not going to meet their challenge by 2030. And I think in this unraveling of the pandemic, we've also noticed the importance of leadership and follow-up and pandemic management. And even on the state level in the United States, we've seen Florida taking a very different path than California. Canada taking a very different path than the United States in pandemic management. Maybe history will tell us which was the right way. All I know, we've lost in the United States close to 1 million people in some form and some fracturing of the question about how do we really manage the next pandemic when we didn't do as well as we thought in this last one. And I think in the process of the pandemic, we've also seen unraveling on the vulnerabilities of global governance structures. We've seen the World Health Organization struggling for authority, of finding the root cause of COVID, of trying to uncover the essential remedies and vaccines that would be given not only to the developed countries, but also to the underdeveloped countries that need it the most. So this limping along during a pandemic, we've certainly learned a lot. And I'm hoping that we will, in the future, emphasize inclusion and equitable policies as we not only get through this pandemic and recovery, but also ready and having early warning systems internationally for the next one. There will be a next one, and there's from the epidemiologist I've talked to, they're predicting that new superbugs are going to take hold where antibiotics will not be effective anymore. So whether it's on the micro scale or the macro scale, we're going to be, I think, looking down the line for the next pandemic, and how do the emphasis, how do we as the mortals on the planet in this Greek tragedy ultimately push our elected officials, push our international governance structures to really pay heed to what we know will come, and ultimately how do we save lives in the process. So just I want to just dive into looking at the historical overview with the Ukraine, the Soviet Ukraine, and the Holodomor, which is the Great Famine of 1932 to 1933, which killed an estimated 10 million people due to the collectivization policy implemented under the leadership of Joseph Stalin. If those of you remember history, that Stalin was trying to catch up with the West after the Bolsheviks were now in power. Lenin really didn't leave the reins to him, but he was able to grab the reins and wanted to industrialize the society. But he couldn't get there unless there was receipts coming out of the agricultural sector. Ukraine was the test case where the Soviets backed into this by killing all these sacrificial lambs due to the collectivization strategy. This period, I think, led down this path where we are now. The Holocaust in the Ukraine, the population suffered under the Nazi occupation, with an estimated 3 million non-Jewish citizens and 1.6 million Jews being killed as part of the German extermination policies, as well as 7 million Ukrainian soldiers dying in combat. Again, we know that, Mr. Putin used his first excuse for invasion of Ukraine recently, that it was becoming Nazified, and that Nazification was taking place in the Ukraine, which of course is a spurious argument, given that Zelensky is Jewish, and they've really sort of come to their resolution about their past in a lot of the memorializing of their killing, the Ukrainians themselves also aiding the Nazis and killing Jews and non-Jews during this period. And then came the Orange Revolution, where nationalized protests came, even with corruption and election fraud, resulting in results tallying victory for the pro-European politician Viktor Yashchenko, who was the predecessor of Zelensky, and really helped in the progress of taking Ukraine into a nationalist perspective. And Ukraine is really torn between the East and the West. Their foreign economic geopolitical aspirations have been vital for Russian domestic defense, as well as a dependent country in regards to supply of gas and other natural resources. The United States sees Ukraine as Russia's doorway to Ukraine, and thereby trying to move Ukraine out of Russia's orbit in order to limit its political and economic stability. NATO expansionism has also been, and EU enlargement has also been a cry coming out of Putin and his war generals. Russia has granted permission to East Germany to becoming a member of NATO after the German unification, under the condition that NATO will refrain from any additional eastward expansion. And that was agreements that were signed after 1949, despite tolerating a continuous NATO expansion and EU enlargement. Russia has reached its limit, I think, and their argument has been that the West courtship of Ukraine is nothing more than a assault against Mother Russia and its blanket of puppet governments that have always surrounded it geopolitically. So we've seen sanctions, treaties, diplomatic means of conflict resolution to work this through, but we're now confronting what I see as a dangerous precipice, where Ukraine is sort of the bridgeway to Russian ambition to rebuild the USSR, and ultimately the EU surrounding Mother Russia in a very different way. As you probably know, Finland has been granted NATO acceptance, and that was on fast track, which now on their western border, they now have about 800 shared miles with the Finnish, which traditionally has stayed neutral along with Sweden against the Russians and the USSR. So despite Putin's argumentation that NATO and the EU forces are ganging up on Mother Russia, despite all the focus on the Ukraine, there are other borders also now that are coming into play, and we may see another front with the Russians attacking the Finnish and ultimately trying to fight on that border as well. So some global risks now, I think, have taken priority in my mind. Geopolitical terrorism, war, nuclear proliferation, transnational crime, corruption. These are not only endemic to the power entities that we see playing out between the three supranations, but what scares me the most is the nuclear proliferation component, and perhaps the use of tactical limited nuclear warfare in Ukraine, which will then spread to other disputed entities. Economic oil stock, the U.S. economic crisis, Chinese having a hard landing after the COVID crisis, the zero COVID policy in China. I think it's all leading to a question of who has oil, who will supply the oil, who will liberate oil from one jurisdiction to another. How do we keep fossil fuels at a bay when we should be moving to solar, wind power, and other non-fossil fuel future, which is, again, the mortals having very little control over this. Societal pandemics, which I mentioned, infectious diseases, the demographic changes are also part of this global risk assessment that the Brookings Institute and Davos and the World Bank and others are already calculating. The environmental, natural disasters, climate change. The UN has been the centrality of really pushing ahead on arrangements to move us in the right direction through many of the sustainable development goals, including goal number 13. But we've been distracted, and we will continue to be distracted, and these goals will slip, as I mentioned. Technology and critical information and infrastructure, the web, global communication breakdown. These are concerns I have about, what happens with new AI involvement in bots and disinformation in the 2024 election in the United States. How will that be looked at and manipulated in this new technological warfare that we see undulating below? And then I think one of the most important thing, if it's not the most important thing, is we're stuck with 20th century global institutions. We don't confess that that's the problem, although it is the problem. The UN, in my opinion, needs to be dismantled, but what comes after? Remember, it was a product of World War II. It was a product of the powers that be after the Great War, Second World War. We don't have a solution on a global level. We don't have global policemen who are going to mandate the requirements that need to be taken in the future. We don't have a democratic UN structure. Just this month, for example, we have issued the World International Court of Justice has issued subpoenas for arrest of Mr. Putin and his Minister of Child Welfare. The Russians are now have a monthly rotational time to be in control of the Security Council. What? You're putting the Russian Federation in charge of the UN Security Council, where at the same time the number of vetoes of China and Russia in the Security Council has prevented the UN from moving forward in combating humanitarian aid, world food relief, to fill in for the blockage of the Ukrainian food coming out of the Crimean area, where the ports go into the Black Sea and all over the world. We're in handcuffs. We're in handcuffs internationally because we're operating under old global institutions that are now dysfunctional. We have some enlightened people in these institutions, but my angst is that they will implode unless we come up with some other solutional entities that will help the vision of this next iteration. So let me just talk about the domestic Russian consumption of the war and give you some data behind that, other than the historical. But how do you think Mr. Putin stays in power? So just a quick history lesson: the USSR, 1922, 1991. Russia was included. The Ukraine was part of, along with 13 other states, of Mother Russia. USSR was the largest country in the world at the time. Over 130 languages existed in the USSR. There have been, over the history, independence movements. In 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev came into power, introducing freedom and reforms. Independence movements began in 1991 in the USSR and have completely devolved into independent countries. Their new president, Vladimir Putin, called the end of the Soviet Union, quote, "the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century." This is how he stays in power. It has been, and he has been trying to gain control of the region ever since. The Ukraine, Putin and the Ukraine, Russia has been especially concerned about the Ukraine joining NATO and the European Union. Russia shares many cultural similarities. The Ukraine has shared many similarities with Russia, especially the South and Eastern region, which are Russian speaking. Putin argues that the Ukraine unfairly inherited historical parts of Russia during the demise of the Soviet Union. So what happened in 2014? Russia annexed the Crimea and supported forces to take control of the eastern region, the Donbass area of the Ukraine. Ukraine wants, obviously, to keep its independence and not allow the encroachment of and seize back both these territories. December 2021, Russia sends troops to the Ukrainian-Russian border. President Putin releases an article asserting that Russians and the Ukrainians are one people. February 2022, Russia sends troops to breakaway regions of the Ukraine located in the Donbass to, quote unquote, keep the peace. Soon after, Russia launches a full-scale invasion of the Ukraine. The invasion was swiftly condemned around the world and within parts of the anti-war Russian population. And human lives are disrupted in this process. As of March 30th, 2022, over 4 million people have fled Ukraine since the Russian invasion. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees indicated that at least half of the refugees from the Ukraine are children. Refugees are traveling to Poland, Romania, Moldova, Hungary primarily. There are estimation that 6.5 million have been displaced within the Ukraine. There are more than 12 million people that are stranded in areas that have been under attack daily by the Russian forces. So in 2015, I know this data is rather old, but I'm trying to make a case. Why are the Russians supporting Mr. Putin? Is there any sort of data that shows the strength of Putin's internal strategy? And indeed there is. If you look at this 2015 Pew Research, you can see the very favorable view of Russia and a lot of confidence in Putin, pretty much running in the 40-47 range percentile. At the start of the unrest in the Ukraine, this starts now moving to the 63-66 range for both the confidence in Putin and a favorable view of Russia. Russian nationalism tied to Putin's vernacular of regaining the majority of Russian people back on his side, using torture and internal restraint on media, has gotten this confidence, I think, into Mr. Putin's favorable ratings. So we start, it's almost 20 points difference as of 2015. If we project this now out to 2023, I would say he's probably in the 80% tile with both these favorable areas. Russians overwhelmingly support Putin's foreign policy and domestic policies. The Pew Research, again, 2015, do you approve or disapprove of the way President Putin is handling China? Approve, 90%. Relationships with the US, 85%, which was, of course, on the downslide even back in 2015. Relations with Ukraine, relations with the EU, energy policy, economics, corruption. These are all indices for internal support of Mr. Putin's war effort, and ultimately to win the hearts and minds of the Russians. Russians blame sanctions and falling oil prices on economic woes. Which of the following causes the most harm to our economy? 33% said Western sanctions, 33% falling oil prices, 25% current government economic policy, 8% says none of the above. So blame the West, blame that our oil policy and prices are falling down to nothingness, blame the sanctions. Ultimately, this is the economic woes caused by us and NATO and the EU. The Russian views of Western powers have plummeted back in 2000 to 2015. Look at just Germany, had such a high percentage favorable view by the Russians. And I trust the Pew Research polling, by the way. They've gone from 79% to 35%, quite a drop. And of course, with the United States, 61% in 2002 to 15% in 2015. And we're now close to the 1 decimal percentage as we now move into the 2023 period. So Ukraine is a very interesting country. It's smack dab sandwiched between Russia and Europe. This is the geopolitical bad position where it sits. And I think that is the problem. The Ukraine also sits in the middle of natural gas pipelines flowing from from Russia to Europe. And ultimately, roughly 160 billion cubic meters of natural gas that Russia sold to Europe last year has to travel through Ukrainian pipelines. This is an economic war as well as a geopolitical, ideological war. Who supplies, who gets the natural gases, and this is more current data, by the way, than the 2015 Pew Research. The Black Sea is the last frontier in the oil and natural gas industries. At present, there are more than 100 wells drilled in compared to 7,000 in the North Sea. So the Black Sea has now become a repository. ExxonMobil is confident that prospects of unexplored Black Sea, that it could be planning to spend $735 million to drill 2 deep water wells in the Ukrainian coast. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to I'm going to leave it here because I want to have a bit of a dialogue. There's more to these slides, which again, you can use in any way to distribute, but I really want to give some recommendations and just quickly move to that. How do we get out of this? And I also included the Russian, the Ukrainian perspective in here, which is another deep dive into what the Ukrainians believe is going on. So my recommendations for the future: promoting dialogue, cooperation among diverse stakeholders for coordinated responses. This is more than just war response. This means, how do you hold peace negotiations, including the women who are the most dispossessed because of having to leave Russia, having to leave the Ukraine, not being at the peace table. Also, the Russian women who are losing their sons and to some degree daughters in the war, and are now burying them instead of watching them live a natural life. So I would bring in more diverse stakeholders to begin this process. On the Russian side, of course, that's going to be hard, but I still think there's a nucleus of anti-war mothers who demonstrated the opposition to the Crimean War and other engagements in Georgia and other places that the Russians have been to where there's been high casualty rates. So I think that's one thing. I would strengthen global institutions through reform, transparency, and diverse representation. And this is, I think, what I said previously. And the last bullet here is also part of that, is inventing new global governance institution for the 21st century, not living a century behind where we should be, but how do we project the future? Maybe we do away with the Security Council. Maybe we don't throw the baby out with the wash water. Maybe we keep the structure of the UN, but we increase the General Assembly as ultimately the parliamentary body that would make the decisions for 187 world countries, and do away with this checking mechanism of the Security Council. That's where we're having problems. That's where the Russians and the Chinese are vetoing progressive momentum. Do away with that. Start a democratic UN where we can actually get something out of. And then I would foster a culture of learning and adaptation among leaders and followers on the local level, building on the national level, ultimately up to the highest levels of the globe. We need people like Macron, who I think he's using peace building to get away from his problems at home, but so be it. I mean, we need enlightened peace leaders who are going to bring the forces together and negotiate our way out of this, and encourage the development of future leaders and followers with the necessary skills. That's why people on this program are so critical. People who are studying global leadership, people who will be future leaders and followers in the near future, whatever domain you're going to rest your hat on. That's what I hope ultimately will end this protracted dispute into a more peaceful globe, and we can get back to the issues at hand: global governance, feeding the planet, good water supply, helping children develop and not be stunted. You just named the issue. We're not paying attention to it now. We have to stop this merry-go-round. We have to go back to looking at how do we grab that ring around the merry-go-round and get it and use it for the common good. I rest my case. Thank you. Any thoughts, comments? Let's open it up if we can.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schockman. It's always so nice to hear you talking about all those global order, global conflicts and issues. We have a comment, kind of a question, more like an opinion in the chat from Sean. I would like to recognize. He says, can we trust the honesty of our responses when Putin simply murders those who oppose him? And then he compliments that if he were Russian, he wouldn't do that because he would rather stay alive, right? Do you want to comment on that?
So, Sean, from what I understand about your question, you're saying Putin is a madman that no one can deal with, and therefore, why do we even try? Is that the essence of your question?
Saying if we're asking the Russians what their opinion is, and if you oppose him, you simply murdered. If I was Russian, I would shut up. I'm not going to say anything bad about him. I'm 100% Putin. Go, go, go.
Sure.
How can we trust it's really how they feel?
Sure. Putin is a rational actor. As irrational as he appears, he actually is a rational actor who understands ultimately that he lives and dies with this war. I think the military eventually, the Wagner group, who are this rogue mercenaries who are out in the field now, killing and harming people to get the Russian way in Africa, Latin America, etc. I think this all has a limited run, because in the end, the forces of structures, especially his military, they're starting to show, first of all, the military is much weaker than we expected them. You know, we now know they're running out of supplies. They're not ad infinitum like the Chinese equipped to fight a war like this. You know, we first thought, oh my God, they're coming in. They're going to, you know, they're going to do such damage quickly. The Blitzkrieg did not happen. Now it's a protracted stalemate, and the West is supplying everything but air power to the Ukrainians. I think the land war, unless he drops a bomb, a nuclear bomb, which will be his last hurrah, and when he does, that's where he commits suicide, a personal suicide, when people who are now nuked in other parts of Europe understand that his irrationality has turned to his madman projection. So I think the internal forces will eventually topple him. I think, you know, the CIA will not go in and assassinate him. That will be more problematic than letting the Russians themselves do away with him, letting the Russian military also have their own internal squabble with the Wagner group, who has already attacked the military. You don't attack the military in Russia, even if you're a Wagner maniac going around as a mercenary. They're having internal battles, and these internal encroachments on each other will eventually concave. And I think you will see more of anti-Putin rhetoric coming out of the established quo, and how do you and I would just wait for him to burn himself out, and I think that's going to be where we will eventually have the forces. And then how do you deal with the Chinese? I mean, that's the other crinkle that just sort of now haunts me and keeps me awake at night. Do the Chinese give him weapons and bolster him up? You know, this new unholy alliance of the Chinese, you know, backing and, you know, Xi Jinping going in and saying, you know, we're in it together. That's scary, because they do have 1/6 of the world. They have the military apparatus. They want to use the Ukraine as their testing ground for Taiwan. That's what I think their limited objective is. If Putin's successful, which I don't think he is, Xi Jinping will continue to rattle his sword saying, we're going to take over, we're going to take over Taiwan and we're moving in. And yet we're building new bases in the Philippines. So it's like a big chess game, and I think he's seeing what's going to go on in the world and not give that full support to buffer up Mr. Putin. And the internal support is so repressed. And how many people have left during the conscription? How many of those have gone to other countries? These are the future Russians who could be in the workforce. These are the Russians who are bright and skilled, and they're leaving in drones, sneaking out in the shadows of midnight to start a new life. They will come back automatically under another regime and start all over. I think this will also show that we'll go back to a bipolar world where it'll just be us and the Chinese. Maybe this has a good scenario. Maybe it does show that we can defeat the Russians, or they will defeat themselves, and the Chinese and us then will continue a bipolar world, and whatever good and bad can come out of that. So that would be my long-winded response to your concern. Manuel, I'm sorry, you had your hand up?
Yes, Dr. Schockman, hello. I have a long-winded question, but I'm going to surmise a little bit of what you said. You yourself stated that you had a bit of a problem with globalization, and that nations themselves are kind of backing off from globalization and becoming more nationalistic. From what you've said so far, like I surmise a little bit that corporate interests have gotten in the way of the globalization process, where nations originally got into it to support their peoples. They find that corporations are what being supported at the expense of peoples, right? So when we see these relations between countries, it is this geopolitical game where they're playing to their best interest, right? And that's how the game goes. Now, when we look at the United States in aiding Ukraine, the way it's been sold is almost like a moral story. Like, we have to defend Ukraine, but we see the geopolitical game that's being played because it's of American interest politically and economically to not allow for Russia to take over Ukraine. Now, pulling back from an American perspective, from a nationalist perspective, people are coming in and saying like, well, we have all of this money that we're now giving to Ukraine to fund them. And where is this money when we have so many people across the United States that are in need? Where has that money been this whole time, right? And so how would you respond to that? Like, why all of a sudden? And I understand, like, the military industrial complex, the money that we put out to them, it's going to help our corporate elite interests kind of bolster themselves up, right? But how does the United States answer to the American people when the American people say like, well, where's the help that needs to happen here? Where's our nationalistic agenda?
Excellent question, and I have perhaps many ways to sort of unravel that. First of all, the but the intra-political world now, given the House of Representatives controlled by the GOP, is already rattling this notion that we're into it for over 6 billion, probably now 8 billion, with a new allocation of resources with some of the new weapons that the Biden administration has granted. So the GOP has latched onto that as a campaign issue. I'm sure that will come up in 2024 as what is our interest here? Henry Kissinger used, let me go back because I'm old and I can reference the Vietnam War. Henry Kissinger told Richard Nixon that the way we're going to win and spend in Vietnam is we're going to invent a new theory called the domino theory. And that the domino theory means if Indochina falls, that communists will be living under your bed and eating your children. And that if Vietnam fell, then Cambodia will fall, and the rest of the Asian countries would fall, including at that point China, which was well into Mao's ascend. So we don't have, my point is, you're absolutely right. We don't have that grand theory of dominoes anymore. Besides, it didn't turn out quite well for the Nixon administration to propagate that. So I think there will be, if Biden wins in 24, and he's already said he would run. If Biden wins, they're going to have to come up with some new development of telling the American people what's in it for us, and not the Ukrainians, not global development of democracy, which was Woodrow Wilson's point that we have to make the world safe for democracy. What I think we will do is to switch this about, we defeat Russia, we now have a bipolar world. It'll be us and China to make it a mano a mano, and we will win in the end, because we're now bringing in the Western alliances, we're pulling in NATO, we're pulling in new forces that will be on our side rather than their side, and we will win more wars if we get down to saber rattling in the future. So do you want your children to grow up in a communist state? It's a sort of perversion of the domino theory, but it will, I think, ultimately show that this is an investment in the future of Pax Americana, which I don't agree with, but I think it can be twisted around to put us back in a unipolar world where we are the dominant force. We are bringing goodness and wholesomeness to the world. We will bring, build democracy and, spread our values, but we have to take care of these thorns in our side. Russia, if we defeat it in Ukraine, will mean these smaller countries also will go into one encampment or the other. India is a critical player now. The BRIC, Brazil, India, Pakistan, what is that? What else is there? There's China's also in there, but there's a new formulation of other countries other than, the major East-West countries who are now going to be major players in this. So your long question was a long answer. I don't have the magical prognosis to say what will happen. I'm just, as a political science, international relations expert, I just think there are so many chess moves to be played out here, and the domestic consumption of that has to be refashioned, especially for Democrats, because I agree with you. People will start doubting, why are we spending 8 billion, 10 billion, trillion, it'll go into trillions pretty soon, for what we can be doing for curing homeless or other manifestations of what we need. We have never projected that anyway. That money doesn't trickle down. It's all a ruse. There has always been national interests that get in the way. We still have treaty obligations, on Paris Accord. We still have treaty obligations with Iran and pacification of the Iranians. What scares me is, China has gotten involved with peace in the Middle East, which has been our territory in the past, but now they're brokering deals with the Sunni and the Shiites between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That's scary. If they are successful in being the new power broker in the world, not us, then the Middle East and all its oil goes to one side of the equation. So all these geopolitical machinations have yet to be played out. And I think we've gotten so far into, and Zelensky is such a great salesman. I think he is a brilliant salesman in what he's taken on and where he's sort of projected himself. He is a mastermind of bringing his country to the attention of the world. And for good and for bad, we're invested. But I think it could also unravel as quickly as it built up. And that ultimately will do us a disservice. It's not just the money already spent, it's the, remember the Ukrainians have been, this is a proxy war. We've lost zero boots on the ground. This is the way it was going to be played. However, Biden has already said if the Chinese attack Taiwan, we're sending in troops. That's it. We're just going to go all out and have it another boots on the ground. Now, our people don't like war. You know, we don't want a protracted war, especially with the Chinese, who will, you know, be dominant in the Asia Pacific region. So we could really mess things up by putting boots on the ground, and anti-war efforts in the United States can turn against all this. So I think that's why Ukraine is such a test model, both for us and for the Chinese. I think the Russians eventually concave. Putin implodes. From my word to God's ears, this will hopefully manifest, and it won't be overnight. And I think it's going to be a lot of carnage and a lot of refugees and a lot of children sacrificed in this process. But, you know, war is never an answer. Did I sort of answer, Manuel? Okay. Daniel, I think we're running out of time, aren't we? So
it's up to you, Dr. Schockman. If
oh,
you
I could go. We could have a
some
pajama
time.
party. We can have a pajama party. I'm ready to go.
Okay.
I'm whipped up on my coffee and cappuccino. So Daniel, you should be writing your dissertation and not online with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Schockman. My question is, how do you see the Putin inclination to Africa? Just last week, he canceled the debt of African countries.
Yep.
And what that would be, what kind of outcomes would come with the Western countries, because Western countries also need Africa, and he
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. So that's why Kamala Harris just got back from Africa with her husband, visiting some spurious countries. I say spurious because I don't think Zambia is the greatest country on the democratic scale, but she has a grandfather who grew up in Zambia, and I've been to Zambia recently. They have a 90% unemployment rate. So I can see why the vice president went through there, both as a sort of a peace building. But what the Chinese have forgotten, oh, by the way, I asked the Zambian taxi driver, who knows more than the government, so what do you think of the Chinese? And 9 out of 10, I took 10 taxis, 9 out of 10 said the Chinese are not helping us. They come in, this is all part of their new Belt and Silk Road, and they want to develop, and they loan us money, number one. They loan us money for infrastructure, for port development, for railroads, for cars, for infrastructure, but they bring in their people to drive the Chinese around. And my taxi cab drivers were bemoaning the fact, why aren't they using local labor, you know, to give money to and to employ? So the Chinese, I think, make more enemies in this in Africa than they're making friends. But they're not stupid. They realize Africa is a great potential natural resource haven for everything from lithium to diamonds to raw materials that have to go out, and the neo-imperialist model still manifesting itself. So what do we do as a countermeasure? We go in, we help develop democracies that have been moving the needle in the right direction. I wouldn't give a penny to Uganda, who just recently passed a very dangerous anti-LGBT piece of legislation that will essentially put any people who have been exposed to jail for a good portion of their life, leading probably to their own death. So we have to pick and choose who are going to be the enlightened countries. And will they help us in the long run, Daniel? You know, Ethiopia is now in a post-war situation where they need us as well as we need them. And I think we brokered some of that peace, and we will have to stay in there for the long run with a lot of the civil wars and the tribal wars that have, really haunted the continent. But is it a winnable? Is it a winnable continent for to get to our side and to bring over? Remember, we weren't involved in the original colonization. The Berlin Conference of 1864 was basically dividing up among the European powers Africa. And we have our own legacy in Latin America, not to glorify US development and exploitation, but we weren't in Africa. We don't have a soiled history other than taking slaves out of the western part of Africa and bringing them along with other slave trade to West Indies and Caribbean and the United States. So how much of this new leadership takes hold, I think, is worth cultivating and worth going back to Latin America as well, where, a lot of the leftist governments, excluding Venezuela, because I think they're in another world at this point, but Chile and Colombia to some degree, Peru is sort of out unknown which way they will settle. But I think these leftists are centrist. And what I've seen in these countries, they will deal with the United States. They want to come under sort of a free trade agreement with us. They want to do commerce. They want to do globalization under their terms, not our terms. So these are all, the battlefields out there, Daniel. I think Africa is an essential one that you've been writing about, but I think the U.S. hegemony has to play a lot more soft diplomatic power than the hard power that we've done in the past, and other countries have made a mistake.
Thank you.
Is anybody getting hungry?
Thank you so much, Dr. Schockman. It has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for sharing your expertise in this area. When we talk about global leadership, this is exactly the type of conversation, in-depth discussion that we should promote more, with several perspectives, several points of view, not only one narrowed perspective. So, and you were a master doing conducting this kind of discussion. So, in the name of the center, I would like to show our appreciation for you for providing your time, giving your time to do that with us today.
Well, this is my intellectual playground, and I love raising the bar for all of us, because no one person has the answer, no one professor has an answer, but collectively we really do make a difference. And I think that, to me, is the reason I got into higher education and why I stay committed to global leadership and change. For me, this is really a two-way street. I expect all of you in your own world to develop your own intellectual juices and become sophisticated in your responses, and to argue, even if someone comes against you in your position, to argue your committed rational basis for getting an argument developed, and reasons and scholarship and things you've been exposed to. All that enters into the realm of a graduate of our program. And I hope you go out and prove me right, because that's really the blessing of being at Pepperdine and being in global leadership. So I thank you all for listening and for your time. For my students, you'll get extra credit in heaven. So there you go. But for my non-students, it's a pleasure to meet you online. And again, follow your intellect and follow your heart, and you can't go wrong. So, and you have some good mentors among us, Dr. Sonia and Dr. Maria. Both are amazing colleagues who really have shown me some light and brilliance, and I turn to them all the time. So Sonia and I have written together. Maria, I always recommend you to my graduate students to go pursue issues that are technical in knowledge, but you need to master that and know that literature and language is so precious, and that's how we communicate as global leaders. So thank you all, and for all of you, do righteousness. That's what you have to do. You don't leave your perch to waste your intellect, and you have to know that you're bringing something to the table with a doctorate, with a master's, with a ability to reason and ponder the future. So I just think and there's no easy way. It's just thinking and studying and arguing with each other. You can be each other's peer mentors in this as well. So it's not always unidirectional. It's, I think, a collective of all of you searching for your own essence and righteousness. So I'll leave it at that, and go have a good dinner. And for those on the East Coast, go to sleep. And thank you all. Happy post-Easter. And I will invite me back. I will definitely come. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to
Thank
see you in our next event on the 27th as well. Bye-bye. Have a good
Bye-bye.
evening.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, Crystal.
Good night.
Good night, Daniel. Thank you for
All right.
being here.
What else do you need from us?
Nothing. Okay. Let me stop recording here. I forgot to record. Sometimes I forget to start recording.